Hello, my name is Norberto Spangaro. I am a director and treasurer of the Doral Community Coalition, and we're going to be covering an analysis of the Doral budget, the City of Doral budget for the period 2016-17, and we're going to have some comparison with prior periods. Let's start with the first chart, which is basically a summary of the financials of the City of Doral. The City of Doral generated in 2013 and 14 around $50 million in revenues. In this new fiscal period of 16-17, the city will be receiving, that's the estimate, $55 million in revenues. That is about 10% increase. The operating expenses, and by operating expenses we mean personnel and operating costs, this does not include capital cost, capital outlay. The city was spending $29.6 million in 13-14, and they estimate to be spending $49 million in the fiscal period of 16-17. The consequence of those revenue and expenses is that the city generated in 13-14 a net cash of $20 million to be added to the reserves so it can be spent in capital outlays or other kind of investments that are needed to sustain the city, build parks, buy buildings, or even construct new roads. In the 16-17 period, with revenues of $55 and expenses of $49 million, the net contribution to capital of the city has diminished to $6.2 million. That is almost one-third of what used to be in 2013 and 14. You can visualize those numbers that we just mentioned in these two pie charts. You can see 2013-14, the green are the revenues, the orange is the expense side, and the net contribution was $20 million. Again, this does not include any capital outlay, new buildings, new equipment, or new streets, new parks. In the 16-17 period, as you can see, revenue is going to 55. The expenses now are more than three-quarters of the half of the pie, with a net contribution to capital of only $62 million. We're going to go through the expense side, looking at the departments that are operating within the city. For the purpose of this analysis, we divided the departments in two, basically, the support groups and the front-end groups. This is an arbitrary breakdown because we consider these groups as those who really don't work in the front part of the city. They're not in the street doing repairs, they're working inside or supporting other groups. As you can see, the expenses of these support groups have gone up from $6.8 million in 13-14 fiscal period to $12,800,000 in the 16-17 period. That is an increase of over 84%, around 84%, with some departments pretty much well above that average, like the Mayor and Council, which is a 119% increase, Human Resources, a 129% increase, and the Technology Department with a 194% increase from $1.2 million to $3.7 million. Let's look at these departments in more detail. Here is the Mayor and Council Department. As we mentioned, it went from $560,000 in expenses, personnel and operating costs in 13-14 to $1.2 million in 16-17. That is an increase of 119%. They more than double their expenses. The Public Affairs Department spent $400,000 in 13-14. Is going to spend $783,000 in 16-17. And economic development didn't exist. It went up to $379,000, almost $380,000, or a 65% increase in a 3-year period. IT, we mentioned IT. In personnel and operating costs, this does not include capital outlay, does not include the purchases of new computer, new equipment, or anything like that. They are expenses were $1,270,000 roughly in 13-14, 1268, and they are going up to $3.7 million in 16-17. That is 194% 4% increase. The general government, you can see that surge in the 14-15 period, the 3,600,000. The reason is the famous Miss Universe, where the city spent more or less $2 million. That's money gone. An increase of 44%. Now let's look at what we call front-end departments. We separate the police department because it's a large department, it's the largest in the city, and deserves to be looked separated. Those groups, planning and zoning, code compliance, public work, parks and recreation and building, they represented in the 13-14 period $9,900,000 in expenses. In the 16-17 period, $16,800,000, an increase of 69%. Again, this does not include the purchase of equipment, the building of new parks. This is just expenses. You can see the parks and recreation is going up from $3,300,000 to $5,700,000, $5,800,000. And we had to consider that probably in the 16-17 period, there is not a full year of running the new parks. So you can expect that in the next period, the expenses are going to go up by some good number. The police has gone up 51% from $12,900,000 to $19 million. We have seen some of the benchmark with the police. It seems that we have the same number of police officers that other cities have, like Weston or maybe even Coral Gables, though we don't see the police in the streets like we see in Coral Gables. And again, I reiterate, parks and recreation, which, by the way, running the parks has some income, but it's roughly $800,000. It's not a big amount. And this does not include equipment or capital outlay or the new building, which would also add to cost when it's finished, it's finalized, and you have to run it. This is the summary. Look at we highlighted on the right side in red the largest increases in the city. The mayor and council mentioned 119%, public affairs 95%, economic development 65% increase in the expenses, human resources 129% in 4 years. Maybe there was not a human resource head in 13-14, but we look at 2012 and the expenses were not that different. So, there is also a consequence in the increase of human resources, which is the increase in personnel in all the other departments. Look at the IT again. And one of the things we got to be careful with IT is the IT department is serving other departments. Therefore, some of the cost that is being charged to IT should be really allocated to other departments. We really don't know because the system doesn't have that information available. I don't even think they have it available inside the city, but at least we cannot access this. The IT department should be allocated their expenses. We should be knowing how much the city of Doral TV costs, how much we spend in video graphics, in doing promotion for political reasons rather than real needs of the city. This is a huge amount of money, and again, does not include capital cost. If you add capital cost, you probably will be adding another $1,500,000. So this is a department that should be carefully looked. Frankly, also, there is an issue sometimes in building your own IT department because it's difficult to attract, good IT people to be working in a city. They prefer to be working in IT companies. Many companies have decided to outsource. I cannot qualify the people we have. I do expect that they will be very good people, but the question is, do we need to spend that kind of money inside the house, or we should be looking at outsourcing and being, giving up to bid and fighting for better pricing and cutting our costs? We talk about general government, public and zoning. You can see the numbers: 60, 59, 77%, 73% in parks and recreation. Total front office, excluding employees, 69% increase. So the support units, 84%. The front offices, excluding police, 69%. Police, 51%. That means that the total expenses of the city has gone up 65% in this 4-year period. At the same time, revenues went up from $50 million to $55 million, a 10% increase. Sometimes you got to wonder, with all the activity of the city, with all the new construction, with all the new developments that have happened, the revenues really don't go up. just merely 10%. Expenses 65%. We mentioned before that means basically in the 13-14 fiscal period, the city generated extra cash of $20 million. Remember, this extra cash should be there to cover depreciation, for the amortization of equipment, to build new roads, to build new buildings, to buy new police cars, etc., etc. You had to replace the drainage, you got to replace the turf in the parks, and so on and so forth. So the city at that time generated $20 million. So it closed the year with a fund balance, reserves basically of $70 million. Throughout the years, now the contribution has dropped dramatically to $6.2 million. So a merely increase of expenses will basically take those $6 million and wipe it off. That means that the city today puts $6 million in cash in reserves. However, by the buildings and the parks, the city is using the fund balance reserves, so it will close the year with only $30 million in reserves. Mandatory has to, has a reserve requirement of 15% over total expenditures plus capital outlay. So it has basically $20 million in liquid reserves, which means that the city does not have anymore the capability of building a new park with its own money. And some of the parks haven't been completed. So we're going to see at the end of next year, but I would argue that this is probably just the limit of reserves the city needs to cover future needs for, again, drainage replacement, infrastructure, etc. So the city is getting in trouble. We mentioned 2 years ago that the trend was a very negative one. If you look at these numbers and you look at it as a company, and you can see a company that only grew revenues in 4-year period of 10% and expenses 65%, that company is going in the wrong direction. The numbers do not reflect a very wealthy position of this company, who happens to be our city. You can see these, more clearer in a graphic. So the blue chart on the left side is general fund revenues. You see how it's growing, limited growth. The expenses are growing substantially higher, and of course, consequently, the net contribution of the reserves have dropped dramatically to approximately, as we said, $6 million in the current period. And looking at expenses, we want to learn on a specific item, which is personnel cost. We took every department and looked at just the personnel cost. And you can see how those costs have gone up throughout the years. And the reason we look at personnel costs is because they represent a substantial amount of the total expenses of the city, and because, frankly, when you build these costs, it's not that easy to control it in the future. So it grows organically. You got to pay more to the people. You got to respect, their performance, and therefore you can expect this is probably the cost that needs to be looked very careful. Look at the mayor and council. In 13-14, they spent $363,000 in personnel costs in that department. In the 16-17 period, they are spending $834,000, 130% increase. Public affairs, 110% increase. Of course, in 13-14, the economic development department didn't exist. Now it has $235,000 in just personal expenses. The city clerk, 14%, seems to be the department that has been kept, more under control. HR more than double their expenses, $208,000 in 13-14, $577,000 in 16-17. IT, we talk about IT, we talk about IT personnel, the difficulties in managing these personnel, providing them with all the quality work they need to have, equipment, training, etc. They went up from $543,000 to $1.6 million. The IT department will be having around 17 people in the 16-17 period. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. It looks like financially this department is one that has to be looked very careful because it's substantially increasing their expenses. Let's look at the other departments that we mentioned, as the front-end departments. You can see the increases. Of course, the police department is the largest one. It went from $11 million to $18 million, a 65% increase. Public Works, the city is aging. There will be more work to be done. And you can expect these to continue. So it went up from 1 million won to 2 million won. And parks and recreation, 97%. Of course, more parks, you need more people. The question also, that we need to be looking at this is just the personal expenses. We don't know the structure. We don't know how much overhead the city has, and it should be in benchmark. When we say we don't know, is because usually you don't have that information available to outsiders. You really need to have a very thorough study how your departments are structured. We mentioned we have a number of police department. The headcount of the police departments is to be the a reasonable number. However, we don't know the kind of work. We don't know, how they compare to Coral Gables, how they compare to Weston, how they compare to other departments in other police departments in terms of the overhead, how many overhead they have compared to others. So there should be we are going in the wrong trend. So there should be a very thorough process to understand the infrastructure that the city is building, how much is really needed, and how much needs to be looked at it and restructure. Let me now go to the chart. We took one example. We took the tax revenues. The city has $50 million in revenue, $32 million is tax revenues. Then you have permits, licenses, etc. You also have the contribution of the sales tax and your participation in the county revenues. So you have another $18 million there. But the direct revenues we have, we took for this analysis, merely for an analysis, is the tax revenues, total tax revenues. And because also this is very much impacted by the new construction, new homes, value of properties, and and that kind of effect. In the 13-14 period, the city is spending personal costs 64% of the tax revenues. You can say you can make a decision, in any business, that when I'm going to spend so much of this side of the income in personnel cost or in cost. Well, that 64%, I have bad news. In the 16-17 period, our tax revenues will not be enough to pay our personal cost. In other words, the personal cost will be 102% of the tax revenues received by the city. The personal cost increased by 72%, the tax revenues increased by 8%. Remember, I mentioned that total expenses increased by 65%. That means that the cost that is going higher in terms of the rate of growth is personal costs with fringes. This is salaries and fringes. It doesn't mean that our personnel is the best paid in Florida, but certainly there is a lot of additional costs and has been an increase in many people, and you saw that when we analyze each department. A way to look at this trend, here it is, the blue line is the personal expense line, and the chart shows the tax revenues in yellow. So you can see, used to be in the 60% range. Now it's the personal expenses are above the tax revenues. We go back to the summary that we started with. 13-14, the city received $50 million in revenues, total revenues. 16-17, 55, 10% increase. Operating expenses went up from 29.6 to 49.0, $49 million, an increase of 65%. And the net operating expenses before capital outlay that the city generated went down from $20 million to $6 million. This is the generation of cash after paying the expenses. So these 20, these 17 and 8 and 6 now that the city generating is the one that has been used or is being used to build new parks, to buy a building for the police, to buy equipment, and is used also to do capital investment that the city needs to do continuously. And as I said, when the city is aging, you're depreciating a lot of the assets. You need to replace and you need to spend the money. And to finalize, here is the same chart, we put these graphics. The green line is the contribution to capital. As you can see, that seems to be going down, seems to be traveling by subway now. So you can expect, you can make a guess and an estimate. And I want to remind you that the revenues are highly dependent on the economic activity. If there is there's slowdown, and actually we have seen some slowdown, and there are less revenues, you still have the expense line. And as we saw, most of the expense line is personal expenses. You cannot really act immediately. So you can cross this line and be negative in the cash generation easily in a couple of years if we continue this trend. We mentioned a year or two ago that the city was going to a trend where we'll be in the red, in a couple of years. Maybe we'll be in 3 years. But that's the way and the direction the city is going. The expenses went up 65%. You can see that in the red line. That red line seems to be traveling by plane. It's flying high and climbing pretty high immediately in just 3 or 4 years. And the blue line goes in our trolley. It goes very flat, very simple, very slow. So look at the gaps. Look at the gaps between expenses and capital contribution. Look at the gap, how it's narrowing between revenues and expenses. That's dangerous. Even if it gets very close and it doesn't cross it, this is serious because we are not generating capital for the future. One of the problems with municipalities is that politicians look at 4 years, they work on a cash basis. If you're a rich city, you're going to spend it. Somebody else will have a problem. I remember one of the meetings of the council with one council member said, well, we had a lot of money. We really need to know and we really need to spend it. Well, they have done a good job. They're spending it. That's bad because they're mortgaging the future of our city. You can contact us through Doral Community Coalition at gmail.com. You can look at our website, www.communitycoalition.org. We are doing this analysis to really help our city understand in a higher level the situation, the financial situation of the city, and started taking actions to look at the future. The city used to have a 5-year plan for any projects over $1 million. That process, that resolution that was approved in the prior administration has not been followed. I think it has actually been canceled. It is sad because anytime you're making an investment today, you're generating costs in the future, you should understand how you're going to be financing that. The city is today in a financial condition that is not in a crisis today, but when you look at 5 years down the road, it's already in a crisis. It's generating the crisis. This has not been sound financial management in our city. We should have kept more expenses. We should have kept the expense line under control and on a much more moderate growth by doing intelligent decisions, but making use of other kind of alternatives that probably you can have by outsourcing, by contracting. There are cities who basically outsource almost everything. So don't hesitate to contact us. We thank you for your time, and we hope that you have now a better feeling of what the financial situation of our city is. Thank you very much.